So welcome back. We are carrying on our series based on Vishvapani's book, which is just here. I think we've got copies of this in the bookshop. I very much recommend it. It's a biography of the Buddha, and it talks quite a lot about the kind of social and political situation and the context that the Buddha was in. It's very interesting. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to start with a story about the Buddha's life, and I'm going to carry on from there basically and kind of draw out various themes from that. So, without saying too much more, I'll begin my story. Is everybody sitting comfortably? Okay. So we're travelling back in time, and we're going to northeast India, in what is now Bihar, but what was then called Magadha. And I'm going to say a lot more about that place, and I'm going to say a bit more about it in the present as well. But for the moment, we're about 2,500 years ago, and it's a full moon. So it's a beautiful, radiant full moon. And the people that we join is a man called King Ajatasattu, and he's there with his court, with his various courtiers. So King Ajatasattu in his court, under the full moon. And it's a beautiful full moon, and he's a very, very rich and powerful king. So he rules over a kingdom, and he's the most powerful and rich ruler in the kingdom of Magadha. So he's a very, very powerful man. But despite all his power, he's uneasy. He is not comfortable. He's extremely unhappy, in fact. And it's said that the moon's serenity mocked him, which I thought is quite a phrase, isn't it? The moon was so serene that it mocked him. Where I'm taking this story from, incidentally, is this book by an order member called Vasantra. So you can read the full version in here. And Vasantra says that the moon's serenity mocked him, which is quite a powerful phrase, isn't it? Imagine feeling that you looked up at this beautiful moon and that somehow the moon was kind of laughing at you or wouldn't let you be peaceful. So why is he uneasy? Why is he not happy? Why does he feel that the moon is mocking him? He's unhappy because he knows how he came to power. He knows how he acceded the throne. And it wasn't good, and it wasn't straightforward. So he was the son of King Bimbisara, who was the ruler of the kingdom before him. But King Ajatasattu was extremely power-hungry. He was a very, very ambitious and very unscrupulous man. And he wanted to do everything he could to gain power as quickly as possible. And he mistrusted his father. He didn't have a good relationship with his father. So it's said that he lived in a world of dark deeds and uneasy suspicions. So because of what he did, he feels uncomfortable. And what he did exactly was that he wanted to gain power, and his father was a reasonable man. So King Bimbisara was a good and reasonable man who was held in high esteem by his people. And because he was a very good and very generous man, he stepped aside for his son. So he stepped aside for the king, and he let him accede the throne. But that wasn't good enough for Ajatasattu. He still wasn't happy, and he didn't quite trust the fact that his father had just stepped aside, even though he'd done it with good intentions. So what he did was he imprisoned his father, and he allowed his father to starve to death. So he killed his father, he murdered his own father. So no wonder his conscience wasn't clear. No wonder Vasantra, as he said, he lived in a world of dark deeds and uneasy suspicions. Not Vasantra, the king, just in case Vasantra's watching this. King Ajatasattu lived in a world of dark deeds and uneasy suspicions. Vasantra lives in a world of beauty, actually. He's a fantastic man. So he couldn't find peace, but he was desperate to. He was ravaged by this sense of uneasiness and this sense of being gnawed at by his own deeds. So this particular evening, he was asking his courtiers, do you know of anyone that can help me? And he went round the various courtiers, and they suggested 6 different wise men. 6 wise men were suggested, 6 sages, 6 men which were held to know the truth, held to be very wise. But as it happened, King Ajatasattu had already seen all of them, and none of them had set his mind at rest. So he said, look, none of them are any good. They can't help me. Do you have any other suggestions? And a man called Jivaka, who was his physician, suggested that he go and see the Buddha. He was a follower of the Buddha, Jivaka. He was a devotee of the Buddha. And actually, he donated some land to the Buddha that the Buddha and his following spent time on, basically. They used this land that Jivaka had donated to them. So he knew that the Buddha could help him. Incidentally, and I'll tell you why this is significant later on, Jivaka had been abandoned as a baby. He'd been left to die, basically, as a baby, and he'd been picked up and he'd been brought up by his adopted family. And he was so grateful to his adopted family that he became a doctor, and he became very, very, very successful at it, and eventually ended up as the king's physician. So I'll come back to that later. So Jivaka suggested going to see the Buddha, and King Ajatasattu agreed to this. So they set out on this mission, and you can imagine he's this great, big, powerful king. I don't know if anybody's ever seen a royal procession, but obviously it's quite a thing to move a member of the royal family. I remember when I was a child, I was 6 years old, waiting for 4 hours in the rain to see Princess Diana going past in the car, and she whizzed past. I thought, it's Princess Diana. There we are. But it's quite a thing, and in those days it was a particularly big thing. So basically they have to get all these elephants ready, and it's said that there were 500 elephants. Now you can imagine organising 500 elephants, can't you? So he's there with his whole retinue. He's there with his courtiers, he's there with lots and lots of people and lots of elephants, basically. And they set out from the palace and they go towards where the Buddha is. They know where the Buddha is and where his followers are. As they get closer, King Ajatasattu starts to become a little bit uneasy. Now the reason for this is, well, firstly, he's worried about how the Buddha's going to greet him, because he knows that the Buddha knows what he's done. It's common knowledge in the kingdom. He's also uneasy because Ajatasattu had a very good relationship, good friendship with a man called Devadatta, who actually plotted against the Buddha. He was an ex-student of the Buddha, but he became very inflated and very ambitious, and he basically set up a plot to discredit the Buddha and his followers. The whole story of that is also in this book, which I recommend reading, but I don't have time to go into it now. But basically, Ajatasattu and Devadatta were in relationship with each other. He'd supported him in the past, and he knew that the Buddha would know that he was friends with this man who had attempted to discredit him and that he'd supported him. So he's worried about that, basically. And he turns to Jivaka and he asks Jivaka, how many people will be there? Like, how many people are we going to see? How many followers are going to be there? And Jivaka tells him, it's about 1,000. There's going to be about 1,000 followers of the Buddha there. And as they get closer, King Ajatasattu becomes more and more uneasy. And the reason for this is that they get within sort of easy travelling distance of the Buddha and his followers, but it's completely silent. So he's thinking, hang on, 1,000 people would be making quite a considerable noise, and I don't hear any noise. So that kind of feeds his paranoia, basically. And it's said that none of his kind of senior advisors could assuage his fear. Only Jivaka could do that. So he says to Jivaka, look, I'm not hearing anything. I'm a bit worried about this, because you're saying there's 1,000 people there, but I don't hear any sound. And Jivaka reassures him. He says, look, I promise you that they're there, it's going to be fine, go and see the Buddha, he'll help you. So he manages to reassure him. And as they get a little bit closer, just through the forest, he sees a small light. So he sees that the Buddha and his followers are actually there. And he's a little bit reassured. And eventually, they come upon the Buddha and his followers in the clearing. And it's a really magnificent sight. There's the Buddha sat there, looking absolutely beautiful and radiant, probably not unlike the position that he's in here. And it's said that he had this incredible aura about him. It's said that there was a thrilling silence about the Buddha, a thrilling silence. And all of his 1,000 followers are there. And the reason why none of them can hear anything is because everybody's sat completely still in meditation. So nobody's making a sound at all. So they enter the clearing where the Buddha and his followers are, and they're all meditating, and eventually the meditation stops, and quietly, very gracefully, the Buddha gets up, and he goes over to greet King Ajatasattu in a way that would be customary to greet the king. So they get the kind of formalities out of the way. They greet each other, they say hello to each other, and the Buddha greets him with real kindliness. So he greets him with metta. He's very, very pleased to see him. He's extremely friendly towards him, and this really sets King Ajatasattu's mind to rest. So after a little while, King Ajatu says, look, I've got a question for you. It's very, very important to me. Can you answer this question? So the Buddha says, of course, I'll answer your question. And he asks him, do your followers gain tangible benefits? Benefits that are as demonstrable as those gained by people who follow traditional trades and occupations. So it's a way of asking, like, what are the benefits if I follow your teaching? You know, what can you do for me? You know, is it like it is for people in the world where they gain money, success and so on? You know, what are the benefits that I would gain from practicing under you? How can I expect my life to change? And the Buddha starts off by talking in very practical terms. He talks about social standing, for example. He says, well, if your courtiers were to leave and come and practice with me, they would gain the respect of the people, they would gain good social standing. And then he talks about gaining calm and confidence from practicing an ethically upright life. So you practice the precepts, you practice positive ethics, and you gain something from that. You gain calm and confidence and a still mind. And eventually he talked about the falling away of the different hindrances that stop us from our minds from being expansive. And then he talked about the states that can arise. So he talked about dhyana, these beautiful, expansive states that can arise in meditation. Wonderful kind of creative states that can arise, that feel more beautiful than anything that you've ever experienced. And he likened this to like being freed from debt or being freed from slavery. And you can imagine what that's like for this king, can't you? Because the king's got a completely restless mind. He doesn't have peace for even 1 minute throughout the day. And here's the Buddha talking about what can happen if you follow his teaching. That you can experience these beautiful, exalted states, that your mind can be completely at rest. And then he talked about insight into the nature of reality, understanding the law of karma, and each stage in the path being higher and sweeter than the last. And then eventually he talks about enlightenment itself, the state of enlightenment. And he talks about this in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So he talks directly to Ajatasattu about the suffering that he's causing, and that it is possible to overcome that suffering, and how it's possible to overcome that suffering. And when those causes that lead to suffering are gone, completely gone, enlightenment arises. How do you think Ajatasattu feels when he hears all that? What do you think?
Relieved.
Relieved, yeah. How else do you think he might feel?
Inspired.
Inspired, yeah. I mean, I feel inspired, and I'm just saying something that I've already written down. Yeah. How else do you think he might feel?
Overwhelmed.
Yeah, so he is. He's inspired, he's relieved, he's overwhelmed, he's completely inspired, actually. It's like the presence of the Buddha has opened something up in him anyway. And on top of that, everything that he's saying to Ajatasattu, it's like he's talking directly to him. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had that experience before. I've had that experience many a time on retreat where my mind is particularly receptive because I'm on retreat. It's like something's opened up and somebody gives a talk or a teaching and it's like they're talking directly to you. You know, they really see you and it's like they're saying exactly what you need to hear at that moment. So this is the experience that Ajatasattu has. So he's so moved that he goes for refuge to the Buddha. So in other words, he promises to follow the teaching of the Buddha for the rest of his life. He says, you know, no other refuge will I take, but you. I go for refuge to you, to your teaching, and to the Sangha, to the spiritual community. And he pledges himself to the Buddha there and then, and he becomes a disciple of the Buddha. Not only that, but he's so moved that he confesses to the Buddha his ethical shortcomings. So particularly he confesses that he's murdered his father. And the Buddha knows this already, but still the act of him confessing it is supremely significant. And the Buddha doesn't react, he just calmly hears what he has to say, so he listens to him very calmly. So he's been very, very moved, he's had this experience, but there is no denying the fact that what he's done, all of the things that he's done actually, there are some what we call weighty karmas in there. So he's done some very, very significant negative things. And those things still slightly play on his mind. In fact, he doesn't stay in this calm state for very long. And within a relatively short time, he takes leave of the Buddha. And he says, actually, look, I'm going to have to go because I've got to attend to some of my kingly duties. So he takes leave of the Buddha, but he promises to come back. He has taken refuge in the Buddha and he's become his disciple, so he will come back and see him. So when he leaves, the Buddha goes back to see his followers and he has a discussion with his closest kind of confidants, so the Buddha's closest disciples. And he says he's extremely happy that King Ajatasattu has come to see him. And he's extremely happy that he's taken refuge in the Buddha. But it also deeply saddens him what he's done, basically. And he says to his followers that actually, if it wasn't for that, then the Buddha knows that basically, if he says to his followers, if it wasn't for that, he would have gained stream entry that very night. So he would have instantly achieved a depth of practice, which meant that he could have never have fallen back, basically. A very, very high level of attainment. The Buddha knows that he could have achieved this had it not been for the things that he's done. But those things that he's done are sort of very much weighing on him. So he knows that those things can be worked through, but that won't happen instantly. And because of those things, he hasn't gained stream entry that night. So that's the story. So I'd just like to kind of unpack that a little bit. And the first thing I'd like to ask is, I'm going to ask you a question, is what do you, because I guess the context is, what does this tell us about the Buddha? So what does this tell us about the Buddha? And the thing that I want to ask you is, what do you notice about how the Buddha addresses Ajatasattu? What do you notice about the way the Buddha responds to him or sort of handles him? What do you notice about that?
Non-judgmental.
He's non-judgmental. Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? So he doesn't judge him on his past actions. He takes him at face value, and also he sees the potential in him. So it's a very, very important fact about the Buddha, is that he would always respond to people's highest potential. So he would see their greatest potential. He wasn't blinkered about what people had done. And he met all sorts of people, including people like this king and murderers and thieves, but he would always respond to people's highest potential. Yeah, so he's non-judgmental. Yeah, thank you, Gary. Anything else that you notice?
There's a special kind of non-judgmentalness in that, although he already knew about the king's misdemeanours, he didn't sort of go, yeah, heard that, yeah. You know, like he listened to the king's version of himself or something like that.
Yeah. So he took him in despite knowing, like when he confesses, the Buddha would know that anyway, but he's completely open to that and he hears it as if for the first time. Yeah. So he's totally open to him regardless of what he knows about his history. Yeah, that's great, thank you. Anything else?
He's attuned to what's on the king's mind.
That's right, yeah. So he sees how troubled he is, doesn't he? And he sees, as you say, what's on his mind, and he comes forth with a teaching that responds wholly to that. He's not just coming out with, well, something that I've been thinking about this week is such and such. He gives a teaching that is completely the thing that he needs to hear. Yeah.
It's really just thinking about this a lot myself, and very difficult. It's not difficult to practice at all, actually. But a lot of people miss the point. And I sort of like just the whole thing about unconditional love, which means, when you see somebody, you can see that they're a product of their past, their things are going on for them internally, externally, and unconditional love is accepting the person for who they are then, and then saying how can I help, and that means that you're not judging them at all for what they're doing, that you're thinking how can I help this person move in a positive direction. That he was like even more concerned, interestingly not concerned, but he's thought of the fact that this guy hasn't been able to get onto the stream level seems to it's not slightly concerned about it, didn't it?
Yes.
Because if only he hadn't done that, then he could have done this.
That's right.
So rather than saying he shouldn't do that, it's like, oh, it's a shame he has done that.
Yeah.
How can I help him move forward?
Yes.
And that's actually something that I think everyone needs to practice. It's interesting how many times you talk to people about this, and then they'll say about an ex or a partner, but they did this, and this means they deserve that. So again, in principle to say unconditional love, but actually when you get a chance to do it yourself, it's not as easy.
So it's a different way of approaching things, isn't it? There's a lot in what you've said, and there's some very, very good points in there. So one is about seeing that somebody is a product of their conditions. That's really, really important. I think it's true that he basically sees that his mind is a product of what he's done, but also kind of seeing his history and what might have led to that as well. And then the other thing is, just paraphrasing what you were saying, but he's concerned about the fact that he hasn't been able to achieve stream entry, for example, not out of a sense of judgmentalness, but he just wants the best for him, basically. Like you say, he wants to help him to reach his potential, basically. Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I did that. I had a flaw recently with not fall out with somebody, and that after I reflected on that, I realised that actually I wasn't. This wasn't a mass murderer. This is something very, very. I hadn't actually done anything at all, really. It was a hunch in my head, but everybody in their lives now had somebody they had a problem with, that they find it difficult to look at that person and say, this is person's a product of what's going on, how can I help? Instead, they react to that and think, how dare you do this to me, I don't deserve this. And there's no, and this is the point of love, it's like ego saying, you should do that to me, whereas he's let go of that completely. It's like, I think the Buddhists need to practice, individuals need to practice that. It's so easy. Tomorrow that will happen to you.
Well, it's a very different way of approaching things, isn't it? Because there's no kind of sense of ego clinging or defensiveness from the Buddha. So it's possible to practice completely unconditional love as he did, because there's no sense of, there's no sense of fear, there's no sense of ego clinging. So he's completely free to just relate from a basis of metta, basically. There's no sense in which he's seeing the king in relationship to himself. So there's no way, he's not looking and thinking, oh, he was a king, I wonder what he thinks of me. There's nothing like that at all. So because of that, he's completely equanimous. So he meets King Ajatasattu, as he meets everybody, with complete equanimity. And I found this really, really impressive. And I was trying to think from my own life if I had any examples to compare this with. I've never met a member of the royal family, but I have met Nile Rodgers, who is basically is kind of much more important than the royal family to me. So for those of you who don't know who Nile Rodgers is, he's the bassist and the main songwriter in a band called Chic, who you'll probably have heard, who did like kind of Good Times, Le Freak, all of this kind of stuff. So he's partly responsible for the birth of hip-hop. Also produced loads of artists in the 80s like Diana Ross, Madonna, David Bowie. Every single time the artist's career was completely flagging, and he would produce their album and it would be the best selling album they've ever done. So he did that with David Bowie when he produced Let's Dance for him. He did it with Diana Ross when he produced Diana. He did it with Madonna for Material Girl. Sorry, I know this isn't strictly Dharma. But anyway, this one day I met Nile Rodgers, and I tell you what, I was not equanimous at all, because this man is like, I don't believe in God, but if there was a God, it would be Nile Rodgers' shape. And because of my friend Tim, who's a very successful musician, he was basically jamming with Nile Rodgers this day. And he said, why don't you come down and meet Noel? And I was like, ooh, really? And I met him, and I was about as unequanimous as it's possible to be. Like, I was shaking so much. I was trying to take a selfie, and I couldn't actually work my phone anymore. So I was kind of going like, ooh, come on. And I had to get somebody else to take a photo. And there's this photo of kind of me and Nile Rodgers, and I just basically looked like I've ascended to some other kind of... I was like, I love you, Mr. Rodgers! But anyway, so that's what happened when I met Nile Rodgers. And that's not what happened when the Buddha met King Ajatasattu. And if the Buddha met Nile Rodgers, he would probably just say something like, really like the first side of that Diana Ross album, something like that. He would just greet him in a friendly way, full of metta, and would really, really take him in. That's the thing. I was completely unable to take this man in. I mean, I was so overwhelmed that I just didn't see him at all. And the really funny thing is, he's such a nice guy that he tried to make conversation with me. Like, he was sort of asking such and such, and I was just kind of dribbling, basically. But anyway, there we are. So he was completely equanimous, and he met King Ajatasattu in an open, beautiful, and friendly way. What an amazing thing it is when that happens, isn't it? There's a retreat centre that I go to in Norfolk called Pamaloka. And one of the teachers there that I'm thinking of in particular, he's a little bit like this. When you meet him, it's like he completely takes you in. And one of the really amazing things about this man is, he's a very senior member of our order, is he remembers the most incredible things about everybody, and he finds a way to relate to everybody as well. So, he'll talk about football with some people, he talks about music a lot with me, he'll ask how certain members of people's family are and so on. And there's hundreds of men go on retreat to this place every year, but somehow he remembers lots of things about each of the people that go there. So he's able to find a way in, a point of contact. So it's a very, very beautiful thing when that happens. And the Buddha was able to do it completely every time with everyone that he met. So he relates to everyone kind of in terms of their potential, with metta, with kindly eyes. And the important thing about this is that that doesn't come from some kind of sense of just wanting to be a good person. or some sense of, oh, you know, it's nice to be nice, or something like that. He's able to do that from a wisdom perspective. He's able to do that because of the depth of wisdom that he has, and also a complete understanding of how the universe works. So you mentioned about karma. Well, you didn't actually say the word karma, but you know, knowing that our actions have consequences, and knowing that we're often a product of our conditions, being able to see people, including their history and what's led them to that point. So the Buddha has a complete understanding of this. He has a complete understanding of how the laws of karma work. So because of that, he's completely open to all, and so is his teaching. So this is particularly significant because this was not, the way the Buddha behaved was not in tune with the dominant ideology of the time. So at the time, the Buddha would have been practicing in a kind of social and political environment which upheld a kind of system of graded inequality, basically. So the kind of priestly caste at the time, who were called the Brahmins, basically, would discriminate on the basis of somebody's birth. So Brahmanism was extremely prevalent in the Buddha's time, as it is still now in India, actually, but I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But the Buddha was extremely critical of this. So time and time again we see in the Buddha's life that he wasn't afraid to criticize. He wasn't afraid to say when he thought something was profoundly wrong, and he felt that it was profoundly wrong to discriminate on the basis of somebody's birth. And he also wasn't afraid to give credit where it was due and to give praise where it was due. But the Buddha, as far as the Buddha was concerned, a society needs to be conducted on the basis of ethics, basically, not just on the basis of kind of different levels of discrimination. And you can see that in the way that the Buddha was with his Sangha. So he welcomed anybody into his Sangha. So you can see that he was welcoming to a king, but he was also welcoming to the people of the kind of the lowliest sections of society as well. And anyone was welcome to join his Sangha. Anyone was welcome to take up his teaching. What was important was their commitment to practicing his teachings, not where they came from. And his Sangha is full of examples of these kind of people. So, for example, there was one of his 10 chief disciples was called Upali, and he was a barber by trade before he gave up his worldly life and went to live with the Buddha. And in India at that time, as now, being a barber was considered quite a low occupation in society, basically, because you're handling kind of physical, offcuts, people's hair and so on. There was also somebody called Sunita, who was a scavenger, and there was 2 nuns in the group of nuns around the Buddha called Punya and Punita, and they were ex-labourers. But as far as the Buddha was concerned, it's not who we are, or it's not our title or our designation in life that makes us who we are. It's our ethical life, basically. It's what we do with ourselves in terms of body, speech and mind. So what we do with our bodies, what we say and what we think. How we practice ethics in accordance with those kind of 3 dimensions. That is the important, not just important thing, but significant thing. That's what's going to have an effect on our lives. So as I said, this is significant because of the dominant ideology of the time. So Brahmanism, which upholds that there are basically, as it does now, so the caste system in India upholds that there are basically four main castes. So there's the Brahmin or priestly caste, the merchants or traders, the warrior caste, and then everybody else who are kind of the labourers and people that are even lower than the labourers at the bottom. And there's thousands of kind of subcastes, but those are the four main castes basically. But as far as the Buddha was concerned, he didn't recognise the caste system at all. And there's this quote which I may come back to later because it's very, very significant. The Buddha said, "By birth one is not an outcast. By birth one is not a Brahmin. By deeds alone one is an outcast. By deeds alone one is a Brahmin." So what he's saying there is, as I said before, it's not what you're born into that is significant. So you may be a king, you may be a member of a wealthy family, but it doesn't carry any truck with the Buddha, basically. He didn't recognise those distinctions. So it's important to understand a little bit of what the Buddha was critical of and why he was critical of it. The thing about the caste system is that you can't escape it in any way, basically. So you can't escape it by marriage, for example. You can't marry out of your caste. In fact, it's forbidden to marry outside of your caste in certain quarters. And just as King Ajatasattu was kind of born into this extreme wealth and privilege, there have been many, many people who were born into the equal and opposite equivalent of that. So born into a horrendous poverty, which they have no chance of escaping, basically, unless they kind of throw off the shackles of caste, basically. And it presents all these kind of social, religious and economic barriers. There's a description which Sangharakshita gives in this book here, which I'm going to read you from now. So this is a book called Ambedkar and Buddhism. So Dr. Ambedkar was a kind of revolutionary in a sense. He came from an untouchable family himself, and by sheer will and determination he managed to get himself an excellent education. And he wrote the Constitution of India, and he worked for his whole life to basically abolish caste. And he converted to Buddhism in his life, and he led millions and millions of what they call untouchable people in India. He led them to a conversion because he believed that in order to really escape untouchability, people would need to throw off Hinduism and convert to another religion. And he believed strongly that the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's critique on caste, was wise and true, and he encouraged his followers to convert to Buddhism, basically. And Sangharakshita has written this excellent book called Ambedkar and Buddhism. It's significant for us because Sangharakshita actually was very, very inspired by Dr. Ambedkar and had quite a bit of contact with him towards the end of his life. There was a mass conversion in Nagpur towards the end of Dr. Ambedkar's life, and Dr. Ambedkar actually asked Sangharakshita originally to lead that conversion, and he very graciously passed it on to a more senior monk, but he was involved with Dr. Ambedkar towards the end of his life and was very, very inspired by his vision. And Bhante Sangharakshita went on to do a lot of work in those communities in India with the Dalit people, or so-called ex-untouchables. So here Bhante talks about the Brahmins. He says, Brahmins are the terrestrial gods, and as such enjoy numerous privileges. According to the texts cited from various Hindu scriptures, the Brahmin is styled the Lord of the universe, even equal to God himself. He is to be worshipped, served, and respected by all. But the Buddha didn't believe this at all. In fact, he often was known to kind of satirize Brahmanism. So to criticize and satirize the fact that somebody can just be born into such privilege by virtue of their birth. And also, I think, critically tying it in with the Buddha's vision and his wisdom. What he was also very, very critical of is a situation where somebody cannot change the situation that they're in life. So I know myself from, I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, but from spending time in India with people who are born into this situation, that the expectation is that you stay in that situation for the rest of your life and you make no attempt to better yourself or to get an education or to work your way out of that dreadful situation. And the Buddha was extremely critical of that. So of course this ties in very, very, this ties in with his teaching on Pratitya Samutpada, that conditions are in flux all the time, and that we have some agency over those conditions. So we can change our minds, we can change our consciousness, of course then we can change our situation. And the Buddha recognized that caste was mind-made. This is the really, really key thing about it, is that actually caste is a concept. It's a mental construct. It doesn't, you can't find caste. There isn't, a caste monument or, it's not a physical thing. It's a mind that exists in the mind of people and, created in the mind of people that would oppress others. And so this is what the Buddha taught, was that caste was mind-made, and that because it was mind-made, that people could throw it off, basically. He was also very critical of the fact that under the caste system, people who were from the so-called untouchable caste. I'll just explain a little bit about what untouchability means as well, because it's horrendous actually. When you're deemed an untouchable, for somebody from the Brahmin caste, if they touch you, if they come into contact with you, basically pollutes them. So they consider that touching somebody from a lower caste pollutes them in some way. So you literally cannot be touched by the higher castes. In fact, even to be within your shadow is polluting. So you have to keep a long distance away from the higher castes, something like 30 feet away. If you touch food, you also have polluted the food as well. So you're not permitted to, for example, drink from the same water source as other people in the village. Often what you find in Indian villages is that people from lower castes are in this kind of ghetto where they're in a separate part of the village, which is always much more horrible than the main part of the village. Often they live on the outskirts of the village, often on the riverbank. They have to wash their clothes in the water source that has been polluted. They have to drink from that water source because they're not allowed to take from the well, which has been unpolluted, basically. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So Bhante gives a description here of what that means in kind of village life. So they were prohibited from studying the scriptures, especially the Vedas, and from engaging in the practice of asceticism. In this respect, they were in much the same position as the Shudras. According to the scriptures, a Shudra may not listen to the recitation of the divinely inspired words of the Vedas. He may not recite them, and he may not learn them by heart. If he listens to them, his ears are to be filled with molten tin or lac. If he recites them, his tongue is to be cut out, and if he learns them by heart, his body is to be split in two. Now you might think that Bhante is sort of taking some poetic license there. He's exaggerating. But unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. And that caste violence is actually relatively commonplace. That it's not unusual for people to be excluded so that they go hungry, or to be beaten, or in extreme cases, even to be killed. And caste atrocities still go on to this day. So some of you will know who I've spoken to, but I work for an organisation called the Karuna Trust. And we're an organisation that fundraises in the UK, and we send money to projects in India. And those projects basically work for the uplift of the people that we're talking about. So they work to get those people an education, to provide them with access to meaningful, fulfilling, well-paid livelihoods that aren't caste-based occupations, and they work for the uplift of women and girls in those communities who are often treated particularly badly. And as I said, unfortunately, caste atrocities still go on to this day. I spend about 2 or 3 months of the year in India with the work that I do, and it's interesting that this story is set in Bihar. Actually, 2 things came to mind. One was, it was interesting when I read this story because, I don't know if you remember, but the Buddhist physician Jivaka, I told you that he'd been abandoned as a baby, and it's obviously it has mythical elements, that story, but it's true. There was a king Ajatasattu, and we assume that there was his physician Jivaka as well. And he was abandoned as a baby, and he was so overjoyed to have been given a chance at life that he wanted to relieve suffering in the world, so he became a physician, and he became the king's physician. And a couple of years ago I was in Bihar, and I was visiting a project there, and on the day that I was there, they brought in this baby that had been abandoned, basically. And when I read this story, I thought immediately of that baby. I thought of this character Jivaka, and I thought of the baby that I'd seen there. So this baby had been abandoned, basically. And it was only because this young man kind of went sort of to the outskirts of the village to kind of answer the call of nature, and he heard this crying, and there was a baby there that had been abandoned. So it was brought into the project. Beautiful, beautiful little baby. And the project took it on and subsequently found it an adopted home. So I was very kind of moved by that when I read about the story of Jivaka. And that's a kind of, it's a fairly happy ending to that story. But unfortunately, the other thing that I'm going to tell you is that I was in Bihar a couple of months ago, and we went to a village for a meeting with some villagers there, and it was this village was one of the villages that this project that we had gone to meet were working with. And this project, they're very, very inspired by the vision of Dr. Ambedkar. When you meet people there in that part of the world, you don't say, namaste or hello, you say Jai Bhim, which basically invokes the memory of Dr. Ambedkar. And we met these villagers, we went there, we said Jai Bhim, we sat down with them, and we heard what they had to say, and they were talking about the conditions in the villages, and we were looking at whether we could do anything with them to provide the village with meaningful livelihoods. And one of these, the young men that was there, he was telling his story, and I didn't catch all of it. I mean, I caught some of it, and then the interpreter told me what he'd been saying, basically, and what it was that there had been a land dispute. So this young man's father, he had some land, and the high caste Hindus there had basically were very, very upset that he had claimed this piece of land, which was actually his legally, but they didn't think that he should own this land. So his family were attacked in the night, and unfortunately the young man's father was beaten to death, and his mother was beaten to within an inch of her life. So she was left paralysed, basically. So the whole family was attacked, and this young man had lived through it, but his father had been murdered, his mother had been left permanently disabled. And if it wasn't for this project, who really, really wonderful organisation, if it wasn't for their intervention, nothing would have happened, basically. He had no legal recourse, he had no power in the situation at all, he's completely powerless. But with the support of this project, he managed to take the case to court, it was being looked at, he'd got some compensation, he'd been able to claim the land, and he'd got some financial compensation as well. But of course, no amount of financial compensation is ever going to repair that kind of damage. So unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that still goes on. It was going on in the Buddhist time, and it's still going on now. However, there are things that there are lives that have been changed, and there are millions and millions of people, thanks to the Buddha's message that's come down through Dr. Ambedkar, that have basically converted out of Hinduism, converted to Buddhism, and decided as far as they can to throw off the shackles of caste. And through the work that the organisations that the Karuna Trust funds, we're changing hundreds of thousands of lives every year. And it is fantastic to go and see, particularly when you see people that have come from very, very difficult situations, very, very challenging situations, how it's possible for those lives to be turned around. So, I mean, I was saying to you that often there are kind of caste-based, there are occupations that go along with caste. So one of them, for example, is that of manual scavenging. So if you're born into a particular social strata or caste, you're expected to spend your life engaged in the occupation of cleaning the human waste, basically cleaning the excrement of the high caste Hindus. So in a lot of villages, they have non-flushing kind of dry latrines, basically, and it's somebody's job who comes from this caste, and that's handed on in a hereditary manner. Somebody's job to clean that up every day, and it's a horrendous thing. I mean, obviously, it's just hearing about that makes you think how disgusting it is, but it also leads to kind of skin conditions and health problems, and such a degrading thing for people to be expected to do. And on top of that, people aren't actually paid for that. They get a few rupees now and again, tiny amounts of money, and they're just thrown a few kind of stale chapatis, basically, for their trouble. And there's a project that we work with very, very closely, who works specifically to liberate people from that occupation, and from bonded labour, from slave labour. And I remember on my last visit, I went and I visited this new project that had been set up, where the women who'd previously been engaged in this occupation were now engaged in making incense and making garments, making clothes. And they freed many, many women from this occupation. And I met this woman called Taslim, who'd been involved with the project for a long time. And she was basically talking about how she had thought that she would have to spend her whole life engaged in this horrible occupation, but now she had a sense of dignity, a sense of self-respect, that she goes to work very, very pleased with what she's doing. She has a real sense of solidarity with the other people that she works with, and she earns a decent living with which she can educate her children. There's another woman that I met who, this was so powerful. She was basically saying about how she was talking to a member of the higher caste, and the higher caste person said to her, listen, if you don't clean this waste, who is going to do it? And she said to him, look, I don't care who's going to do it. Throw it out of a tractor for all I care. She said, throw it out of an aeroplane, but I'm not going to do it anymore. I've basically taken an oath that I'm not going to engage in this occupation anymore. So this is significant for us, because as I said, I mentioned a little bit about Dr. Ambedkar, and our teacher, Sangharakshita, he spent a significant amount of time with Dr. Ambedkar towards the end of his life. And when Sangharakshita was asked what was his proudest achievement, he said it was working with the ex-untouchable communities of India. He saw that as his biggest achievement and the thing that he was proudest of, basically. And as I said, this work still goes on with the work that the Karuna Trust funds now. So just to conclude, it's also, I think it's good to think about what is the relevance of this for us. So what's the relevance for us for this in the modern day, particularly for us here that aren't as affected by the issues that I've talked about? Well, one thing is, just because those issues are going on, are going on far away, it doesn't mean that they're insignificant. So there are things that we can do to address those inequalities. So, for example, we could give money to Karanal, or we could do a Karanal fundraising appeal. And we can just bear those things in mind, and we can wish those people well. I think it's also interesting to think about the Buddha's kind of wisdom perspective. This thing of the way he approached people and the way he treated people. So he believed strongly that in order for society to change, we need to work on ourselves, and we need to be basically addressing our ignorance. We need to be practicing in order to change ourselves from the inside out. And that's the only way that society is going to change. So he was very, very critical of just political systems that existed for the sake of it. And I think we see this again and again, don't we? Like at the moment, there's a tremendous kind of sort of ennui, and there's a sense of disillusionment, isn't there, about our political system currently. We've lost trust in our leaders in a sense. But actually there is something that we can take responsibility for, and that is our development. And the more we change and grow, the more we will change, and the more the world around us will change. And I think it's also important to think about the way the Buddha approached people in terms of looking beyond what they'd done, or looking beyond who they were. So as I said, he would greet thieves, murderers, people from other devotees, and he would meet them all in the same way. He would meet them with kindness, he would meet them with metta. Could you meet Donald Trump with metta? That's the question, isn't it? Can we actually look beyond somebody's position? Often, we have this negativity, don't we, towards people that actually we don't really know who they are. And every human being is suffering. Every human being wants to be happy. And every human being is a product of their conditions. We're also a product of our conditions. And because we have the Dharma, we can change our conditions for the better. And we can change those conditions infinitely. The Buddha, through his efforts, through his enlightenment, changed so many lives. And not just that, through the lineage of his teaching, still now, tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives have been changed for the better through his teaching. And what he was very, very keen to stress is that his Dharma, his teaching, was not just for the chosen few. It was for everybody. It wasn't just for the select few and leave the others in darkness. His teaching, he was open to everybody, and his teaching was open to everybody, and it's open to us. All we need to do is practice it. Okay, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you.